The voicemail began on its own, and the voice shook like wet glass. Lena Hart said, "Who is this?" As the whisper rasped, "They know where you are," and died into a hiss. The hallway clock ticked louder than her breath. A scream tore the night outside, sharp and brief, then silence sealed the air. Lena Hart said, "Hello?" to no one, and the word felt too loud. She stepped onto the porch, rain stinging like needles on bare skin. The street was empty except for a fallen brass key on the curb. Its bow held a black inlay etched with symbols that bent the eyes. Lena Hart said, "This is a sick joke," but her palm kept the key. A lone streetlight flickered, and the ocean wind carried sea salt and rot. The houses watched like shut mouths. Her phone chimed again, but the screen was blank and cold. She tasted metal and old fear from a childhood night she never named. Lena Hart said, "Not again," and the key warmed in her hand as if waking. Thunder rolled low, and somewhere a dog started, and then stopped. Something unseen shifted behind her, and she chose not to turn. Back inside, the old heater coughed, and the house felt too small for her ghosts. Lena Hart said, "You do not get to live here," but the memory did anyway. She had left the hospital 5 years ago with scars no one saw. Sleepless nights still came like debt collectors. The voicemail replayed in her head, in a voice she almost knew. She set the key on the table and watched water ring the wood like a target. Lena Hart said, "If this is about Ryan, you are late," and shame pressed her lungs. The lost brother was a room she never opened, yet his name walked in. A newspaper clipping peeked from a drawer, edges soft with handling. She closed it and locked the drawer, even though there was no lock. The wind rattled the vent, and the house sighed like a tired animal. Her coffee tasted like pennies and winter. Lena Hart said, "You are fine," and the lie warmed for a second, then cooled. A car idled outside and rolled away before she could look. The key waited like a question she had avoided her whole life. The feeling of eyes returned, thin as a wire drawn across skin. Lena Hart said, "If you want me to look, make me," and forced herself to the window. The street was a mirror with no face. A camera flash popped from a dark sedan, then darkness folded back in. She counted her breaths to 4, the way the counselor taught her. Lena Hart said, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the method kept the panic at the edge. She killed the lamp and watched the room become a shadow box. The key glinted like an ember in a cave. Her phone buzzed with a text that had no sender name. It read, "Find the door we never built." The words hooked something old and tender. Lena Hart said, "I do not build doors, I break them," but the bravado shook. A reflection moved in the glass behind her shoulder, then stilled. She turned, and nothing waited but furniture and rain sound. The heater clicked off, and the silence rang like cut crystal. 3 knocks landed on the door like measured heartbeats. Lena Hart said, "No one sane knocks at 2:30, and slid the chain. The man outside wore rain like armor, and did not shiver. He was Elias Crow, a 45-year-old male with careful eyes and a suit gone soft at the edges. He held no umbrella and offered no smile. Elias Crow said, "You picked up the key," and the words sounded rehearsed. She kept the door on the chain and measured his stance. He smelled like cold metal and car leather. Elias Crow said, "If you want the truth, you have 3 days," and he showed an old photograph of Ryan on a pier. Her stomach fell through the floor. Lena Hart said, "Tell me what you are," and he blinked once, as if debating humanity. He slid a card under the door with an address and no name. The porch bulb hummed, and thunder rolled like a verdict she did not want. She set the photograph beside the key and felt both burn through the table. Lena Hart said, 3 days is a trick, but her pulse begged for answers. The address pointed to the abandoned observatory on Mariner Hill. She had not been there since the night sirens took her brother from the dark. The text pulsed again with a single word, "Run." Lena Hart said, "From what?" And the heater restarted with a cough. Tires hissed outside and settled into silence like a held breath. She packed a small bag with a flashlight and a knife she never used. The key went into her pocket, its weight unreasonable and alive. Lena Hart said, "If this is a trap, I spring it," and the house agreed with a creak. She killed the lights and let the rain right on the windows. The hallway clock advanced 1 minute, and it sounded like a door unlatching. She stepped into the night, and the street light steadied, as if watching. The observatory loomed above Mariner Hill like a blind eye against the storm. Lena Hart said, "I should not be here," but the key weighed heavier with every step. The gate was locked, but rust flaked under her grip as it surrendered. She climbed the winding path lined with cedars that hissed in the rain. A memory clung to her ribs, Ryan whispering once about the stars, promising they kept secrets. The dome's silhouette cut the sky like a knife. Lena Hart said, "Secrets keep us," and pressed on. The building smelled of mildew and burnt copper. Inside, the air tasted like dust and thunder. Graffiti sprawled across the cracked walls, half symbols she recognized from the key. A shiver worked its way down her spine. She lit her flashlight, its beam cutting jagged slices through the dark. Something scuttled behind the broken telescope, but silence followed. Lena Hart said, "If someone is here, speak," and her voice died in the hollow chamber. Only her echo returned, faintly altered, as if another voice rode within it. The flashlight beam found a chair set in the center, perfectly upright, too deliberate. On its seat lay a journal wrapped in torn leather. Lena Hart said, "Ryan's," though she had no proof. She picked it up and pages fell brittle against her thumb. The writing was a scrawl, some words human, some twisting into unreadable symbols like those etched on the key. A sudden clang from the dome above made her flinch. She aimed the beam upward, finding nothing but rust and shadows. The journal pulsed with dampness, almost warm. She tucked it into her bag, chest pounding. Lena Hart said, "If you wanted me to find this, then what else is waiting?" A smell of ozone filled the chamber, as the old telescope creaked without wind. She thought she saw movement at its base, the shadow of boots, but when she advanced it was only dark floor. Her breath smoked in air that should not have been cold. The silence pressed tighter, as though the walls leaned closer with each passing second. The journal's weight pulled at her shoulder, as if alive. Lena Hart said, "Ryan, what did you leave me?" And the question soured her tongue. She crouched by the telescope base, noticing chalk lines spiraling outward, intersecting with symbols. Her flashlight trembled in her grip. She remembered her brother drawing spirals in notebooks, saying they meant paths no one could close. She traced one with her finger, dust clinging. The ground thudded faintly, like a drum deep underground. She froze, breath caught. A voice whispered her name exactly, not imagined. Lena Hart said, "Who is that?" and turned sharply. At the door stood Samuel Price, 38, male, broad-shouldered, raincoat hanging heavy, eyes guilty. He was once her closest friend, now a stranger holding secrets. Samuel Price said, "You should not have come alone." His gaze never met hers, pinned instead to the journal strap. The air swelled with dread, and for the first time she wanted to run. Samuel stepped closer, boots scraping chalk into dust. Lena Hart said, "You knew about this," and her voice was both question and accusation. His mouth worked before words came. Samuel Price said, "I told you once to leave the past dead. You didn't listen." His hand hovered near his pocket, like holding something unseen. Lena braced her stance. Samuel's face was lined, not by age, but by guilt. He glanced at the journal strap, then at the brass key bulge. Samuel Price said, "That key opens more than doors," and his tone sank into warning. A low hum shivered through the observatory, as though the building itself agreed. Lena Hart said, "If you know something, say it," but he only shook his head. Rain tapped louder on the cracked dome above them. Samuel's shadow stretched long and warped across the spiral. For a heartbeat, She thought it split, as if two shadows walked behind him. The room pressed in like lungs collapsing, ready to smother them both. The silence cracked when glass shattered high above, shards falling like cold stars. Lena raised her arm, shielding her face. Samuel ducked but did not flinch enough to seem surprised. Lena Hart said, "You brought me into this," and her anger steadied her hand on the flashlight beam. Samuel Price said, "No, they would have found you anyway," and his voice broke. The beam caught movement at the far wall, someone watching too still to be chance. The silent observer, tall, featureless in shadow, stood half in and half out of sight. Lena's skin crawled. Samuel backed toward the doorway, eyes refusing to look at the figure. The journal throbbed against her shoulder, demanding attention. Lena Hart said, "Who is that?" But no one answered. The figure lifted one hand, slow and deliberate, then lowered it like a command. In the next blink, the corner was empty. Only the dripping rain and their pounding breaths remained. The walk down from the observatory was more suffocating than the climb. Lena Hart said, "They are closing in," and every cedar creaked like a sentinel. Samuel Price trailed behind, his silence cutting sharper than words. The journal pressed like fire into her shoulder. Halfway down the path, a second figure emerged. Mara Vance, 36, female, wiry frame, leather jacket, eyes darting like knives. She was the outsider no one trusted. Mara Vance said, "You want answers, you need me." Her voice was smoke and defiance. Samuel tensed, hand near his coat. Lena felt the storm pull tighter, thunder rolling through their bones. Mara dropped a folded map in the mud, its ink bleeding into rainwater, showing circles marked with the same key symbols. Lena Hart said, "Why would I trust you?" Mara smiled, sharp and wrong. Mara Vance said, "Because the others already know your door is open." The wind snapped branches, and shadows stitched themselves together between the trees, moving as one. The map bled rivers of black ink, and Lena crouched despite the cold mud. Symbols swirled into patterns she recognized from Ryan's notebooks. Lena Hart said, "He drew these same spirals," her voice cracking. Mara's eyes narrowed. Mara Vance said, "Then your brother saw them too." Samuel's jaw tightened, his silence an admission. Lena's flashlight beam flickered, batteries whining. She struck it against her palm until light returned. The trees whispered as if rehearsing secrets. Mara crouched closer, her finger pressing one circle labeled with Ryan's name. Mara Vance said, "This is where he broke the seal." The words chilled Lena's marrow. She stood abruptly, shoving the map back. Samuel stepped forward, voice finally surfacing. Samuel Price said, "That's enough," but Mara only smirked. The rain thickened, drowning their breaths, and from the distance came the hollow bark of a dog that never finished. Lena Hart said, "We're not alone here," and the map dissolved into the mud like it had never been. Lightning ripped the sky, painting the forest in stark silver. The flash revealed a body hanging from a cedar, swaying like a pendulum. Lena gasped, stumbling back into Samuel's chest. The tragic victim was Clara Miles, 29, female, once their neighbor, now lifeless with wrists bound and eyes wide open. Lena Hart said, "She had nothing to do with this," horror filling her chest. Mara Vance said, "They send messages in flesh." Samuel looked away, his face locked in guilt. The rope creaked as the wind twisted Clara's body, her necklace glinting with the same symbol etched into the key. Lena felt bile rise. She shone the flashlight higher, the beam shaking. The trees pressed in, each branch heavy with silence. Mara whispered, "We have to cut her down," but made no move. Samuel's hand twitched, but he stayed frozen. Lena Hart said, "If this is their warning, they think we'll stop," her voice brittle. The storm swallowed her words whole. They lowered Clara's body, laying her gently in the mud. Lena knelt, brushing wet hair from her still face. Lena Hart said, "I'm sorry," her voice breaking. Samuel finally crouched beside her, pressing fingers to Clara's pendant. Hi, Samuel Price said. This wasn't random tone heavy. Mara shifted uneasily, scanning the tree line. Mara Vance said, they're close. The pendant etched into Clara's skin left a burn mark, black as coal. Lena pulled her hand away, trembling. The journal seemed heavier, throbbing against her back like a heartbeat. Thunder cracked, closer now. Mara drew a knife from her jacket, blade glistening with rain. Samuel's hand remained in his coat, hidden. Lena Hart said, if either of you know more, tell me now, but silence swallowed her demand. Clara's eyes stared upward, glassy, reflecting flashes of lightning. The forest shuddered with a low vibration, like engines humming underground. Lena looked to the horizon where a pale light began to pulse between the trees. The pale light grew brighter, moving like a lantern but without flame. Lena's chest tightened. Mara Vance said, that's them, her voice stripped of defiance. Samuel stepped back, eyes wide, whispering something she couldn't hear. Lena Hart said, no running this time, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. The figure appeared, a man cloaked in shadows, features shifting, never fixed. His presence thickened the air harder to breathe. He was the villain with the hidden agenda, smiling faintly as if amused by their terror. He stopped 10 paces away, head tilting, rain sliding off him without soaking his clothes. Lena raised her voice. Lena Hart said, what do you want from us? But his only reply was silence. Then he raised a hand, and Clara's pendant blazed brighter until it cracked apart in Samuel's palm. Samuel shouted, dropping it, shaking his burned hand. The cloaked man vanished into the rain, leaving the forest darker than before. Lena Hart whispered, we are already his pieces. The forest spat them out onto a desolate service road, the rain easing to a mist. Lena Hart said he wanted us to follow, and her legs shook with every step. Mara Vance lit a cigarette that hissed in the drizzle. Samuel Price walked behind, clutching his bandaged hand. The journal felt heavier than bone in Lena's pack, pulling her spine down. An old billboard loomed crooked, its paint peeled to reveal words half gone, we watch. Lena looked away. Mara Vance said, the address from Crow leads to the pier, her voice low. Samuel muttered, that place is poison. The pier was where Ryan disappeared. Lena's chest clenched at the memory of sirens and silence. The mist curled around their ankles, as though guiding them forward. Street lamps flickered, one by one, as they walked. Lena Hart said, then that's where the truth lives, though fear hollowed her words. The road stretched ahead like a wound that never closed. The pier rose from the fog like a skeletal hand. Lena Hart said, I swore I'd never come back here, her voice cracking. The wood groaned under their steps. The ocean's breath was cold and metallic. At the far end stood Elias Crow, 45 male, suit damp, holding an umbrella that did not shield him fully. He looked carved from the storm. Elias Crow said, you brought the journal, his tone neither pleased nor angry, only certain. Mara bristled, her knife at her side. Samuel's jaw clenched. Lena clutched the pack strap tighter. The waves below slapped against the beams, rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Elias continued, Ryan knew too much, but he left you the rest. His gaze slid past her toward the shadows, shifting under the pier. Lena Hart said, tell me why Ryan died, but Elias did not answer. Instead he opened his palm, revealing a key identical to hers, but darker, its symbols burning faint red. The glow from Crow's key painted the fog crimson. Lena's heart hammered. Samuel whispered, that key belongs to them, and stepped back. Mara scoffed. Mara Vance said, then why does he still breathe? Crow's gaze fixed on Lena. Elias Crow said, yours opens what is closed. He pointed toward the ocean, where faint shapes glimmered beneath the waves. The journal in Lena's pack pulsed hot, as if alive. She pulled it free, pages rattling in the wind. Symbols on the paper lit faintly, answering Crow's key. Lena Hart said, Ryan was protecting something, and the truth slashed her gut. Crow's expression broke for the first time, sorrow flickering like a candle. Elias Crow said, "Ryan was protecting you." The words left her hollow. The waves churned harder, water climbing the posts. Mara leaned close. "Mara Vance," said, "this is bigger than family," her voice almost reverent. Thunder cracked, and the journal snapped shut on its own. The water split with a sound like tearing metal. From the deep rose an object, an iron door, impossible and massive, chained shut. Lena staggered back. Lena Hart said, "That's what the key is for," terror roughening her throat. Samuel grabbed her arm. Samuel Price said, "If you open it, we're finished." Crow shook his head, rain dripping from his hair. Elias Crow said, "If she doesn't, we're already finished." Mara's eyes glimmered with hunger. Mara Vance said, "Then let it open." The door's surface crawled with symbols, the same as Ryan's sketches, glowing faint like embers. Waves foamed angrily around it, yet it stood solid. The journal throbbed against Lena's chest like a second heartbeat. Thunder slammed again, lightning illuminating the chains straining as if eager to break. The pier beneath them groaned as if about to collapse. Lena Hart whispered, "Ryan knew this wasn't meant to stay buried." The door towered over them, dripping sea and silence. Chains rattled without wind. Crow stepped forward, his key pulsing brighter. Elias Crow said Ryan was the seal. His death broke half of it, you are the rest. Lena's knees weakened. Samuel shouted, "Stop lying," but doubt cracked his voice. Mara's laughter cut sharp. Mara Vance said, "The villain's closer than you think," and her gaze pierced Samuel. He stiffened, face paling. Lena Hart said, "What are you hiding?" Samuel's silence roared louder than the waves. The ground shook, the pier splintering. The silent observer stood now at the far end, still and waiting, drenched but unmoving. Lightning framed his shape. The journal burned in Lena's hands until she dropped it. Pages flared in white fire, yet didn't burn away. Elias Crow said, "Choose, or the sea will." Lena's breath shattered, the storm swallowing her answer before she could give it. The pier buckled as the chains on the iron door tightened like waking serpents. Lena Hart said, "If I open it, I end us," and the truth scraped her throat raw. Elias Crow stepped nearer, rain glossing his suit like armor. Elias Crow said, "If you refuse, they end more than us," and his eyes held ruin. Samuel Price grabbed her wrist and flinched as pain lit his burned hand. Samuel Price said, "He's steering you to the edge," and the planks groaned under his weight. Mara Vance circled, blade low, eyes bright with terrible hope. Mara Vance said, "Choose the door or watch the tide take everything." The silent observer waited at the pier's far glow, still as a lighthouse shadow. The journal fluttered with a heat that did not warm. Lena Hart said, "Ryan kept this shut for a reason," and the sky split with another white crack. Waves hammered the piles like fists. The door's symbols brightened, and the key in her pocket grew hot as a coal. She stood between fear and duty, and neither moved. Lena pulled the brass key, and it pulsed like a heartbeat against her palm. Elias Crow said, "Align it to the break," and pointed to a cracked sigil near the chain. She hesitated as the pendant shards at their feet slid slightly with the sway. Samuel Price said, "He is not your ally," and the wind stole half his words. Mara Vance said, "He is not our enemy either," and the knife flashed as if answering. Lena Hart said, "Both can be true," and stepped to the edge where spray clawed her boots. The key hummed in a pitch that matched the sea. The door leaned closer without moving, dragging her forward by invisible inches. Elias Crow said, "Ryan closed this at a cost," and sorrow flared across his face. Samuel's gaze broke, guilt hissing out like steam. Lena pressed the key to the sigil and felt the metal yield like skin. Cold rushed through her arm, 1,000 hands pulling. She held on and tasted salt and old iron. The chain uncoiled an inch, and a sound like breath escaped the seam. Lena jerked back as the key seared her palm and cooled again. Elias Crow said half open, and the fog reddened faintly. Samuel stepped between her and the door, face sick with dread. Samuel Price said, "You do not know what asks to be let in," and his voice fractured. Mara Vance said, "Or what begs to get out," and her smile died at the edges. The sea rose to meet the threshold as if summoned. The silent observer lifted one hand, a slow verdict that asked nothing. Lena Hart said, "The truth is on both sides," and felt the journal throb against her ribs. She pictured Ryan at the pier, his promise to keep the night from swallowing their town. Guilt flooded her bones like cold smoke. Elias Crow said, "He wanted you free of it," and the words landed like nails. The chain shivered, impatient and hungry. The pier lurched, and one board split, dumping spray across their legs. Samuel grabbed Lena's shoulder, but she wrenched free. Lena Hart said, "Tell me what you did," and her words hit like stones. Samuel's eyes finally met hers and broke. Samuel Price said, "I told them where Ryan was that night," and shame hollowed his stance. Mara inhaled as if stabbed by air. Mara Vance said, "You sold him," and the knife dipped toward the sea. Elias Crow looked to the door as if to spare Samuel the weight. Elias Crow said, "He was promised protection he never received." Lena staggered, memory unspooling into a burning thread. She saw Samuel's late calls, his van parked 2 streets over, the night sirens. Lena Hart said, "You were my brother," and her voice was iron and ash. Samuel nodded once, as if drowning and accepting it. The chain rattled like applause for a confession. Lena did not step back. She pressed the key again, and the sigil flared like sunrise under ice. The chain screamed and fell, link splashing into black water. Elias Crow said, "Brace," and the word barely reached her. The iron door cracked wide enough to show darkness that felt like depth, not void. Air roared out, dragging rain sideways and pulling at hair and breath. The silent observer vanished in the pull as if swallowed by a thought. Mara Vance said, "We have seconds," and seized Lena's elbow, steadying her without softness. Samuel Price said, "Let me finish what I started," but fear bled through his courage. Lena Hart said, "You will answer after," and pushed the door to its stopping point. The sea paused, a held inhale. From below rose a sound like many voices, speaking one word she could not understand. The brass key cooled, expressionless in her fist, and the night waited for its price. The door breathed out a wind that tasted like rusted midnight and old salt. Lena Hart said, "Show yourself," and the dark obliged. The cloaked villain stepped from the seam, face shifting like smoke over bone. Mara Vance said, "Pick a face," cowered, yet her blade lowered an inch. Samuel Price stood rigid, fear carving lines deeper than rain ever could. Elias Crow said, "Stand behind me," but no one moved. The sea flattened, as if listening for a verdict it already knew. The villain said nothing. Instead he held out a pendant twin to Clarice, uncracked and bright. Lena Hart said, "You took her," and guilt flashed in Samuel's eyes. The journal's white fire died to ash at her feet. The villain raised 2 fingers, and the chains trembled like nerves. Mara Vance said, "He wants the keys united," and her voice held awe and dread. Lena felt Ryan's absence like a hand pressed hard over her mouth. Thunder rolled nearer, slow as a judge crossing a room. Elias stepped forward, and the crimson key in his hand throbbed like a wound. Elias Crow said, "I served the order that built this door. Then I betrayed them." The words struck like cold iron. Mara Vance said, "You used us," and her knife rose again. He shook his head, rain stringing from his hair like wires. Elias Crow said, "Ryan made me promise to keep you free, until choice found you." Lena Hart said, "So you staged the path," and his silence was confession. The villain extended the bright pendant toward Samuel, as if offering absolution. Samuel Price said, "I can end it," and stepped once, hunger and shame fighting in his eyes. Lena felt the pull of the door gnaw her heels. The sea whispered with 1,000 unlearned names. Elias Crow said, "He wants a second seal, and he wants it to be you." Samuel's breath hitched, and the pendant's light crawled greedily across his burned palm. The deck snapped at a seam and tilted, sending spray over their knees. "Ah!" Mara caught Lena's arm and dragged her to balance. Maravant said, "Choose the living," and fear fled her eyes, leaving iron. The villain flicked 2 fingers and the silent observer appeared at his side, still as a verdict. Samuel lunged for the pendant and seized it hard. Samuel Price said, "Let me pay it," and light climbed his forearm like frost. Elias moved to stop him, but a blast from the door hurled him back. Lena Hart said, "Samuel, do not," and the wind stole her plea. The pendant burned brighter until it showed Ryan's reflection in the wet wood. Mara's knife flashed and cut the cord, and the pendant bounced toward the edge. The silent observer slid to block it without walking. The sea roared, impatient and huge. The villain's shifting face smoothed into something almost kind, and that terrified her most. Lena remembered Ryan at 9 tracing spirals on cheap paper, whispering, "We lock with names." Her breath steadied. Lena Hart said, "This door opens to a word, not a world," and the storm blinked. Elias lifted himself, blood mingling with rain at his temple. Elias Crow said, "Speak the counter-name and bind the debt," and his eyes begged her to try. The villain tilted his head, as if listening for an old song. Samuel trembled, pendant light pooling in his palm like milk. Maravant said, "Tell me the word," but Lena already knew only its shape. She pressed the brass key to her tongue and it tasted like pennies and winter. Lena Hart said, "Ryan, lend it," and the glyphs flared to life across the door. From the seam came a chorus that sounded like grief learning to stand. The silent observer flinched for the first time, and a crack snaked across his shadow. The counter-name rose like heat through a frozen room, syllables breaking on her teeth. Lena Hart said, "Be silent and be sealed," and the door shuddered. The chains slithered from the deep and wound back, links locking with hungry clicks. The villain stepped in, calm as a priest at a funeral. The wind punched outward, shoving them to their heels. Elias Crow said, "Finish it," and thrust his crimson key into her free hand. She crossed both keys and the glyphs braided into a single burning line. Samuel Price said, "Let me hold it with you," and together they pressed the crossing into the seam. Maravant said, "Now," and slammed her knife into the final latch. Light ripped through the fog, bright as noon, then vanished. The door sealed with a sigh that felt like mercy and loss at once. The silent observer dissolved to rain. The villain smiled without teeth and whispered, almost tender, "See you soon," before he peeled into darkness and was gone. The wind died as if the door had swallowed the storm's last breath. Broken boards settled and the sea began to breathe like a sleeping animal. Lena Hart said, "It is done," but the word felt fragile in the air. Maravant sheathed her knife with a motion that looked like a prayer. Samuel Price stared at his blistered palm, as if reading a sentence only he could see. Elias Crow said, "The order will hunt the missing keys," and his voice carried no triumph. The brass key lay cold against Lena's heart, heavier than any chain. Gulls circled low and wary, refusing to land on the ruined pier. Lena Hart said, "Ryan, I hope I chose right," and the name landed soft and sharp. Mara's jaw eased, then set again, like a door on a faulty hinge. Samuel Price said, "I will tell the truth," and rainwater ran clear down his face. Elias touched the sealed seam and flinched as if it bit him. The glyphs dimmed to scars, old and patient. Lena Hart said, "We leave before dawn," and the ocean agreed in one long sigh. They reached town at first light, and found the harbor wrapped in yellow tape. Coffee steam rose from a patrol car like a small, hopeful ghost. Sheriff Nora Hale, 50, female, stood with a clipboard and eyes that missed nothing. Nora Hale said, "We got reports of screams and lights," and she studied their ruinous clothes. Elias Crow half bowed, then held his silence like a badge. Mara Vance said, "We were never here," and her smile asked for trouble. Samuel Price stepped forward as if to confess to the ocean itself. Lena Hart said, "A woman named Clara deserves more than tape," and the words cut a path. Nora's jaw tightened around an answer she did not give. Sirens murmured in the distance, tired and late. The town looked smaller, like it had been fenced by the night. Nora Hale said, "Come in for statements," and left the door open to caution. Lena Hart said later, and her refusal sounded like a vow she would keep. The harbor gulls wheeled once and fled inland. They met the eccentric insider in a basement that smelled like newsprint and rain. Dr. Hollis Reed, 60 male, thin as a bookmark, spread maps like a magician. Hollis Reed said, "Doors are words carved into places," and his fingers tapped spirals. Lena Hart said, "It answered a name," and the room leaned closer. He nodded, delighted and sad. Hollis Reed said, "Names collect debts, and your family kept the ledger." Samuel Price flinched, shadowed by his choices. Mara Vance said, "What hunts us now?" and wiped salt from her sleeve. Hollis poured weak tea and ignored the shake in his hand. Hollis Reed said, "The order will try to reopen what you sealed." But not there. He pointed to inland circles inked in a rusty red. Elias Crow looked away as if the ink accused him. Lena Hart said, "Ryan knew this map," and grief steadied her spine. Hollis Reed said, "He left you the last line," and slid a torn scrap that matched the journal's ash. The scrap read, "We speak or we sink." Dusk found them at Ryan's pierside memorial, a weathered bench, and a jar of shells. The wind moved soft, like someone careful not to wake a child. Lena Hart said, "You were the seal and the warning," and she set the torn scrap beneath the jar. Samuel Price stood a step behind, unwilling to be forgiven, yet unwilling to leave. Samuel Price said, "I will tell the sheriff everything," and the vow shook but stood. Mara Vance watched the horizon as if it might attempt a second entrance. Mara Vance said, "If they come, we make them pay in names," and her mouth was steel. Elias Crow said, "I will draw them off," and the choice cracked his face into something human. A bell clanged out on the water, one deep note with no source. Lena Hart said, "We are done running," and the bench seemed to agree. The sea kept its counsel and lapped the posts in small, patient breaths. Night gathered without threat, only witness. Back home, the hallway clock ticked like a steady heart that belonged to the house. The brass key lay on the table where the voicemail began nights ago. Lena Hart said, "We speak or we sink," and the words felt heavier than iron. Her phone lit by itself, screen blank, then a voicemail queued without number. She pressed play and heard her own voice whisper, "They know where you are." Then silence. The room shrank until only the table and the key seemed real. A second message arrived and played without touch. Ryan's voice said, "You did not close it, you changed it," and the spike of love hurt. The light in the hall went out as if it blinked. Footsteps paused on the porch, measured and polite. Mara texted, "We stand," and Samuel wrote, "I am here." A shadow slid under the door and stopped at the threshold like a decision. Lena Hart said, "Then let it come," and the brass key turned once on its own and faced the dark.